Thank you, Phil. I appreciate that modern take on the Thomas story. It tells us that as human beings, we're wired for survival. Most of what we do day in and day out is based on the firing of patterns of neurons that keep us alive and out of harm's way. Those patterns can go a bit haywire when our lives are really threatened. The disciples experienced that. When Jesus was tortured and crucified, each of them was traumatized. They each experienced tremendous fear in those harrowing few days. Then something happened that began transforming them. One by one, they were seeing Jesus, alive and well. Each responded to the resurrection in his or her own way. We saw some of that last week on Easter Sunday. Mary Magdalene's first response was consternation. She thought Jesus' corpse had been moved to some unknown location. She asked a gardener if he knew where. Only when the gardener spoke her name did Mary realize that Jesus, her teacher, was standing in front of her, and he was indeed alive. Mary couldn't contain herself. She ran to tell the others that she had seen him. That was her response. Peter was the first one she told. He ran to see the evidence of the resurrection, an empty tomb and some folded up wrappings that used to be around the body. But he wasn't quite sure what he thought had happened there. The beloved disciple saw the same things Peter did, and he believed that Jesus was alive, even without knowing that all of this was prophesied to happen in this way. In today's ancient testimony from John's Gospel, we heard that after a few days, the disciples regrouped in that same upper room where they had last gathered with Jesus for the Passover. They had gathered there before all of this drama and trauma unfolded. And Diana Butler Bass calls this upper room their happy place. The place where they had been comfortable, sitting around the table with Jesus. The place where they last had felt really loved. Only this time, when they gathered, the door was bolted for fear. They couldn't trust anyone, especially the authorities who had turned Jesus over to Pilate and the mob. In spite of the locked doors, Jesus entered the room, blessed them, and ate with them, and the whole group of them were moved to gratitude and faith. And they told anyone who would listen. Thomas was the only one of the inner circle who wasn't there at the time. And no matter what the other 10 said, that they had heard him speak, that they had talked to him, that they had eaten with him, Thomas was not going to believe until he could have his own personal experience. That's why we call him Doubting Thomas. But I don't believe that Thomas was so much expressing doubt as he was expressing a deep need. He longed to be transformed, to have what his brothers and sisters had had, a direct encounter with the risen Christ. Trauma can leave us fearful, suspicious, vulnerable, and grasping for assurance. I certainly know that to have been true in my own life. In 1994, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, just 9 months after my mother died at age 62. The grief and trauma of my mother's too early death hadn't worn off yet when my own diagnosis came. Tom and I had 2 small children, and Tom was working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, to keep the mortgage paid and food on the table. That diagnosis of cancer raised the specter of death and disintegration of our family. At that point, we were grasping for any kind of reassurance. My treatment would include surgery, a radical mastectomy with reconstruction from my own body tissues, and that was a long and intense surgery. It would be several weeks before I would gain the strength to resume my roles at work and at home. I couldn't drive. I couldn't stretch out my right arm. A small group of people gathered round us to support us through this crisis. People from church helped us with house cleaning, and people from the children's schools took them to and from while I stayed home recovering. I was not quite ready to venture out when our 11-year-old son Sean decided that he could walk home from school by himself. And it wasn't too many days before he was walking home from school and he got mugged in front of our house by a group of young men who tried to steal his starter jacket and his watch. When he resisted, they punched him in the face. Tom was home that day and he heard Sean's screams from the street. Tom ran out of the house and chased the attackers, eventually stopping one of them, and that's how the police came to arrest them. That's how we found out that they were participating in a gang recruitment exercise. We spent the night at the police station, and when we returned home, it was to huddle in fear. Standing up to a gang wasn't going to be easy, as we would find out. They knew where we lived. They would intimidate and harass us with rocks through the dining room windows and staged break-ins. We couldn't hide, but we could run. This was Chicago, right? I called my dad in Texas and I asked if we could come home. I think he must have been scared too, but he was willing to take us in, all four of us. We could live with him until we got our bearings. So after that phone call to my dad, I felt better. We at least had a place to go, but we still had to get there. And it would take time to implement our plan. When I went to bed that night, I was hopeful. And that night I dreamt for the first time in a long time. I dreamt about looking for a new place to live. In my dream, I remember walking around this vacant apartment. There was a storm threatening outside, but it felt safe inside. I passed a bar, and on the bar there was a telephone, one of those old black ones with the receiver connected by the spiral cord. As I tried to imagine myself living in this place, now, mind you, I'm dreaming, the phone began to ring. I didn't rush to answer it because I was quite certain it was for the previous occupants, not for me. But that phone wouldn't stop ringing. It didn't go to voicemail. It seemed to just ring all the more insistently. So I decided, okay, I'll pick it up and I'll tell the caller, you have the wrong number, right? When I raised the handset and said hello, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Mom, is that you? Yes, it's me, she said. I would have called you sooner, but I thought you might be afraid. Oh no, I'm not afraid, I lied. Hearing her voice, my heart started to pound hard enough to threaten the connection to my mother. And I so wanted to keep that connection, but I was rapidly waking from the dream. Just when I couldn't fight consciousness anymore, I heard her say, I just called to tell you that I love you. I knew then. I knew that I was loved by a love that would stop at nothing to communicate. And just like that, the fear was gone, disappeared. Just like Thomas. He didn't doubt that Jesus was alive because he was obstinate. He knew what he needed. He needed a flesh and blood encounter with the life that transcends death, and he got it. Jesus came 8 days after he had first appeared to the 10, and he walked through mud brick walls again to be present with Thomas, allowing him to put his hands in his hands and in his side. And after that, all the disciples except Judas had encountered Jesus alive. And we know what those encounters did to them, encouraging them for the work that Jesus had prepared them to do, the work of sharing the teachings, of building up a community of followers who would live by Jesus' new commandment to love one another as God loves you. Their gratitude overcame their fear. Like Diana Butler Bass points out, fear is a natural response to danger. Fear is one of those brain patterns that can save our lives, but it can also cripple us if it becomes chronic. Love, compassion, gratitude, these are the antidotes to fear. Brain research shows that gratitude and compassion displace fear. But we all know that some of us live with that sort of chronic level of fear all the time. We call it anxiety. Anxiety can have many causes. Trauma from our past, as well as present threats to our safety and well-being. Whenever we live with fear or anxiety, there is a cost. That cost is both to us and to our communities. Living with fear and anxiety causes us to suffer, to pull inward, to be suspicious, to withdraw from participation. The unfolding Easter story is about love that overcomes fear and anxiety. In the chapter we read today, Jesus walks through walls to free his friends from the fear of death. But notice, that freedom wasn't just for them, for that inner circle, so they could feel better. It was for what they would do, how they would share, so that everyone got a chance to have freedom from fear, so that everyone got new life. That's how it worked for me. After my dream, the voice of love was so clear and real that I experienced that kind of gratitude that displaces fear. I knew I could face whatever came. I could fight my cancer. I would be there to help my son recover from the trauma of being mugged. As a family, we would go to court on the day the alleged attackers were to appear before the judge, and we would not be afraid. So we were there in the waiting room, along with someone from our church who was acting as witness support. When the police officer who had made the arrest walked up to us, he had a message for us, a message from the father of one of the young men. That father wanted us to know that he was sorry for what his son had done. But more than that, the officer said, this young man's father wanted us to know that he had taken his son out of that school and out of that neighborhood where he was being exposed to gang recruitment. That father assured us that he would take care of his son and help him face the consequences of his behavior. We were so grateful to hear that some good news could come from this awful experience. It was awful for us, but we knew it was also awful for those young men. We witnessed that day another of the many ways that love walks through walls to conquer fear and death. And now we began seeing it everywhere. In our reading, Jesus asks Thomas, "Have you believed because you've seen me? Well, blessed are those who have not seen me and have come to believe." I think Jesus said this because he knew that in the days after his resurrection, some of us would be in desperate straits and pray and need reassurance, and yet we would not have personal, direct experience of Jesus, the love that walks through walls. But that doesn't mean that God has abandoned us. In those dark places, we can rely on something else. We can rely on the testimony of our brothers and sisters sharing freely that they have seen the risen Christ. And so I ask you today, have you seen him? Has she come to you in your hour of need? If you have a story, don't be afraid to share it, because this is how it works now. In your sharing, God becomes present for another. We are God's hands and feet. Our sharing, our lives, and our gratitude and our faith has the power to break down walls and transform our world with love. God knows we need it. How will we do it? Amen.